Welcome to the Shomari and Paul Podcast. This is a podcast between two educator friends, one black and one white, where they have free-flowing conversations about issues of race, power, and privilege, both in their personal lives and in their work in the educational system. In today's episode, Shomari and Paul talk about who they are, how they came to know each other, and the ways race, power, and privilege have been woven throughout their lived experiences.
Good day, everyone. I am Shomari Jones. Currently, I am the Director of Equity and Strategic Engagement for the Bellevue School District. I'm very happy to be here with you today as we embark upon this journey to do a series of podcasts that will elevate people's consciousness from varying perspectives of both Paul and I and the guests that we include into our show. A little bit about me. Originally, I hail from Gary, Indiana, and moved on to Chicago, Illinois, shortly thereafter in my youth. I grew up in that community that was predominantly Black. I'm one of the very fortunate few of the people who I associate with regularly who can state that my lived experience when I was young was all Black, from my teachers to the administrators in my school buildings to all of my neighbors. I remember very distinctly that one block away from the home in which we were living, there was a public library. Like, all the librarians are Black. Like, just to see such an infusion of people who look like me. And of course, I didn't know this at that time, but in reflecting back, to see an infusion of people who look like me every single day was all affirming, and even more affirming as I trajected through my K-12 experience. And my parents moved a bunch, but as I continue to move forward through that experience, there were a lot of transitions from all Black to fairly racially mixed to all white, which was a tragedy, to a very racially mixed experience again. And then after I graduated from high school in Oak Park, Illinois, I went on to Tuskegee University, an all Black university, HBCU, and ultimately studied aerospace engineering and math. And here I am, an educator. Who knows how that happened? But we'll talk a lot more in this about our journeys. I presently do a tremendous amount of work in the realm of racial equity, from the policy level to the structural, infrastructural transformation level. It also includes a bunch of stuff in the arena of family engagement and student engagement, and working alongside our school board and our superintendent as an advisor to our overarching work. And it's a highly stressful position, especially as a Black male in this work. I find that my cohorts who have similar positions tend to last about 3 years. You're really good if you last 4. I've been in this role for 6.5, approaching 7. I understand the heaviness and the weight of being in a position where you, the traditionally oppressed, are responsible for lifting people who are experiencing similar challenges as you out of those positions into greater amounts of thrival, while continuing to feel and seem to be oppressed at the same time. And so no easy job. I wake up every morning ready, though, to try my best to change the world. And again, I'm just excited to have this opportunity to partner with a close comrade and homie who's going to take it from here. Paul.
Yeah, thank you for that, Shomari. So I'm Paul Sutton. I'm a white man. I'm currently an assistant professor of education at Pacific Lutheran University. Shomari, I always find it really interesting when you start talking about where you grew up and what that was like for you, because I mean, in some ways, how you were surrounded by Black teachers and Black community members and just, the Black community in general. I grew up in a highly segregated suburb of Los Angeles. Both my parents were educators. I have 4 sisters, 3 of whom are older and 1 is younger, and I have a brother. We grew up in a pretty small house, so like a 900 square foot house for all 8 of us, and with 1 bathroom. And I remember when I was growing up, how, I wouldn't classify us as poor, but we were broke a lot of the time. Money was always a question mark month in, month out. But because my parents were educators, at least the money was consistent, right? It was one of those middle class jobs where you could always kind of count on that paycheck being there and stuff like that. But yeah, so I grew up in a very white community. I remember being around other kids of color, but those memories are really really unusual, because most of the kids I was around were white. My parents were both Catholic, fairly strictly so. They sent us to private schools, K through 12, and so when I went to the private school I went to for my elementary school, I was probably one of the least resource kids there. And I always wearing hand-me-downs for my brother and stuff like that. And so it was, I think it was both I think I had a very typical childhood, but an atypical childhood at times too. And I think like that has really kind of shaped in many ways, like the person I become, why I'm interested in public education, why, coming from 2 teachers, why teaching seems to be such a comfortable fit for me. And as we start talking a little bit more about racial equity work in particular, and maybe equity work more broadly, the more I think about why I am engaged in that work, the more my background, the more my childhood, the more like just how I felt as a kid when I was in different school settings, I think has really, really influenced the choices I've made when I'm an adult, but in ways that haven't always been clear to me. Yeah, I mean, and in terms of education, I bounced around a lot. I transferred high schools, junior year, for different reasons. I attended a small private college in Montana for 1 year, and then I transferred to Portland State University, where I got my bachelor's, and then I left the country and got a master's in English from a university in England. And I did some teaching, I got a degree or a master's in teaching from Seattle University, taught in in the Bellevue School District for a little while, then went back and got my doctorate. So I think my path has been one where it's quite typical. I think of other folks, it's fairly common, of especially white folks, but there are some parts of it that I think are somewhat uncommon, or maybe not usual. Just I think, again, because of my childhood and how I grew up and who my parents were and stuff. So yeah, so that's kind of me in broad strokes, but I'm sure we'll get more into it in just a minute.
I do have a question for you. Thinking about the plethora of people in your household, and knowing and having conversations with you and believing that as a white man, you're growing in your consciousness of how to engage in being a white man in the world in service of those who look different than you. I'm curious to know, what's the experience now when you go back home, when you are amidst your family, has your family come along in a journey well enough for you to feel comfortable with these types of discussions? Have they sort of stayed, in a pretty segregated mindset, based on how they were raised, which is the same way you were raised, but due to your experiences, I believe that, it's changed the way you've shown up differently.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Shomari. And both my parents, I've got no recollection growing up of either one of my parents talking about race, with the exception of my dad, who, when he talked about race, I mean, if he were to say some of those things now, it would be pretty bad. So I remember sitting watching a Lakers game with him and we were watching one of those old school Lakers versus Celtics games. And he turned to me, and I may have been in middle school or something, and he said, "Paul, why aren't there more white men in basketball?" And I didn't know what to do with that question. In part because my dad never talked to me about race.
Mm-hmm.
And when he did, it was questions like that. And I didn't have any racial literacy. Like, nobody in my school talked about race. Nobody, none of my friends talked about race. In my family, we didn't talk about race. So when those questions came up, I didn't really know how to handle it. And I have to assume that my siblings experienced the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom being from Wisconsin, which is a highly segregated state, much like much of the Midwest, she didn't really have the skills to talk about race. Or, if my parents did talk about race, it was more of like this colorblind mentality, which I think is fairly typical of folks from their generation. But when we get together now, kind of to answer your question, Shomari, when we get together now, there are varied levels of racial awareness. My siblings all identify as, Democrats, in some cases left leaning. So they can all talk, to a certain extent, that talk about race. But to the extent to which they are deeply aware, or the way they have examined their own personal lives around race, it's hard for me to say. We get together as a group maybe once a year, maybe once every couple years. And we do have like conversations about race, but they're more superficial. They're more about other people's views about race, not ours, if that makes sense. Like, we're very comfortable talking about how other people might be racist and not how we are racist. And I always wonder the extent to which that is a white predicament. That's how white people just in general talk about race, but that's how we tend to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that, because, the next segment, we're going to talk about how we got to this racial equity work in general. And I'll kind of start my conversation off by stating that, honestly, it chose me. I think often how sometimes in circumstances based on who you are or what skill sets you exhibit, people come for you in ways that they believe you can change or transform the world. And so, again, going back to a little bit of my history, I went to school for aerospace engineering and math. I really liked Top Gun a lot. It was such a good movie, and I watched it a lot of times. And so I wanted to be a pilot, no doubt. And so aerospace engineering was the pathway, and the Air Force ROTC, was the vessel and the money that I needed in order to have enough resources to walk that pathway. And so I'm obviously not that. Once I graduated from school and I got married, and my spouse was not enlisted. She was activated into the United States Navy as an officer. We began to move a lot. And after several moves, we landed in Washington State, where I met a gentleman who almost sight unseen offered me an opportunity to work at one of our local universities here, University of Washington, where I began connecting with young, dominantly Black males who were coming for summer programming to that institution. And we had 6 weeks long of just connecting, engaging, educating, adventuring, and exploring, and just building a family, because this was a residential program. And so that job led me to a series of other opportunities that really, I'm going to use this word, but it's not a derogatory word. It really pitted me in this type of work in an evolutionary way that caused me to continually grow into a space of leadership that allowed me to influence how folks like me, especially since that was the work that I was doing, which was serving folks like me. The evolution of my positions allowed me to benefit folks like me by way of instituting either programming or policy or practices that would better support students when they show up. All of those jobs led to this present job that I have at the Bellevue School District. I did not start at the Bellevue School District in this role. I started in a role that focused on graduation success and moving closer towards the elimination of the achievement gap. But when you really pull back the layers of that onion, dominantly the achievement gap is riddled with students who are Black, Brown, Native, Southeast Asian, which to me then became racial equity work. Shortly thereafter, I did assume this role of director of equity. It felt like it fit so tremendously in that I had elevated to a space where I can actually now begin to transform policy in ways that would subsequently increase the amount of individuals in our organization who began to practice in the way that we deemed you need to practice your craft, your particular profession. And so we're still continually growing in that arena. We call it continuous improvement. For the rest of the world, it is simply a perpetual cycle of us trying to infuse ideologies and ways of people to be immersed in circumstances and situations that are different than theirs. We totally believe in multiple perspectives. That is the way that some of our people are going to grow from having this unilateral perspective and point of view of how the world exists to something that's more inclusive of the narrative that is shared with you by those people who are experiencing some of that trauma. And with that, we're growing as a people. We're growing as an organization. We're hoping to produce individuals in our students that enter into the world with a deeper level of consciousness and a greater sense of readiness to be solid citizens for all the people that they're going to encounter.
So Shomari, you and I have been talking about these things for months and months. And whenever you talk about how racial equity work kind of found you, I can't help but think about how I had the privilege to choose it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you ever think, like, as a Black man, like, do you ever feel a tension when you just think of our different paths in life? How in some cases, like, I don't know if the phrase thrust upon you is right, but how, it chose you, and how me and people who look like me get to choose that work. Like, do you ever feel a tension around that? Like, as a Black man, about like how you feel an expectation to do this work at all, and how folks like me just don't? Like, there's zero expectation that white men get involved in this work.
Yeah, I do now. I would not say I felt that my entire life. And I think we, the people, all get to have that choice of which pathway we go down. I consider this, and you and I have had this discussion before, I consider this like the Matrix. And you have a choice to take the red or the blue pill. And depending on the pill that you choose to take, it will expose you to the pathway that is either deeply conscious and feeling obligated to transform the world for others, or a little less conscious and living in a potential false bliss that does not nearly impact you as much as those who live in deeper consciousness. And so a lot happened to me when I went to Tuskegee. It was a space with individuals who looked like me from across the globe. We had very few white kids, maybe 4 or 5 in the university. We had 1 or 2 Asian kids. I believe both of those 2 groups got minority scholarships. Imagine that. And while there, and especially while interfacing with a couple of really dynamic professors, I was taught how to be a servant for justice, and in particular for my people. And once I took that red pill, there's almost no turning back from that, because you start delving into the reality of the circumstances that are around you. You're taught to understand better the ways of the world that existed in your youth and how you got to be at the place in which you are presently. And really cement it when I came here to Seattle, to Washington. I started working with youth directly in my first couple of jobs, and just to see the amount of challenge and struggle that some of our young people have before they even walk into the space where folks ostracize you and devalue you based on the color of your skin. Just to live in a world where you know that you're being depicted as lesser than. People don't think that you have the capability to do ... To live in that space is really tough. And to be the person who is on the peripheral, observing, especially our developing kids, the ones who are coming up in age, observing these negative inputs that are consistently being drilled into your mind, I feel a responsibility. I will feel this responsibility for the rest of my life. I deem it because I took the right pill, not the wrong pill. I would never want to turn back. If I could live the rest of my life without feeling this level of oppression because I took this other pill, knowing that oppression still exists, I wouldn't. I would never take it back. I'm willing to ingest or assume the responsibility and or the trauma for others, especially if those others are developing young people who are going to be in spaces like me one day where they then get to pay that forward. I've lived a privileged enough life, and especially now where I'm immersed in a bunch of spaces to do just what I propose that I'd like to do for the rest of my world, and that's disrupt, and that's transform, and that's make the world a bit better space for the people who I get to impact today. The sadness that I have around this type of work is that I can absolutely transform the experiences that our people are having that are right in front of me. I'm nervous about when I'm no longer there. When someone deems that I'm not useful any longer in this space, or I'm just a little bit too disruptive and we need to onboard someone who's less, I'm nervous about what happens to our young people, our children, our families, even our staff who identify as BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, because someone's got to be fighting for them. The system is not. And the system is no easy beast to transform itself. And so that's a little bit of that journey, Paul, and some of the responsibility I feel. I did say that, though, I'm proposing that there's a terminal date on this responsibility because there is a strong health and well-being factor that I must pay attention to when doing this body of work. The exhaustion, my nervous system, and how just anxious I get sometimes now. It's a newer thing around circumstances I know that are going to be traumatizing. The perpetual fight is really difficult. I do often tell the narrative around Martin Luther King Jr. and him being assassinated in his early 40s, and autopsy to discover that his organs were that of a man in their mid 60s or very, very late 60s, and how all the stress he internalized was killing him. And so I know that there's a point in time where I have to take care of myself and find a different pathway to impact the world in this way, but do know that my objective is to impact the world in this way for the rest of my life.
Yeah. I mean, I asked that question because I wonder a lot about this, and I wonder a lot about how me and people like me get involved in this work, and how it really is a true choice for us, right? I mean, we can make the argument that it shouldn't be, right? That white folks should always be engaged in this work, but as things stand right now, we get the choice to be engaged. And moreover, when we do get engaged and we're deemed useful in the effort towards equity and racial equity, I think we're given a lot more recognition for it. Like somehow what we're doing is special, or better, right? And so I'm always kind of curious about the extent to which, like, you and I have come to the work differently, how not necessarily we think about it differently, but the responsibility we feel to do that work might be a little bit different. I'm kind of fascinated by that space a little bit. Yeah, so for me, I mean, so much of, you know, my interest in doing work in equity and racial equity, like I said, has to do with my childhood. And I, you know, yes, we were a white family. Yes, we were able to live in a community, largely white community, because we were white. We had a ton of advantage and privilege that we got from that. Because my parents sent me to Catholic schools or private schools for the majority of my childhood. You know, I went to school with kids who had more money than me. So, so I always kind of felt, my friends were always like the outsiders. I always kind of felt like an outsider in those spaces, in those classroom spaces. It wasn't until I got, you know, into high school, like my last 2 years in high school, where I actually started to feel comfortable being in school. And I think a lot of my interest in racial equity work actually first started out as an interest in equity work, or just in this idea that, like, fundamentally society is unfair to groups of people, and I didn't understand why. There's one of my earliest memories in elementary school was second grade, and, you know, we used to do show and tell, and all of my class was white students except for one Latina student. And to the best of my memory, nobody was friends with her. To the best of my memory, there was one day where it was her turn to do show and tell, and she brought a ball that, like, her parent, I think her dad, had bought her at a place like Bartell's Drug or Walgreens or someplace like that, and it was one of those pink, really super bouncy balls. She got up and she wanted to talk about it. And she was very soft-spoken. Thinking back, she was probably English language learning student, but the school didn't accommodate those things for her at the time. And she got up to talk about her ball, and she spoke very quietly. And the teacher kept telling her, "You need to speak up, you need to speak up." And she got more and more nervous. And she talked about how much she loved this ball because her dad got it for her. And she was done, and the teacher just, like, totally lit into her, like, started asking her questions that she never would have asked me or any one of my students about, like, why do you think you deserve that? You know, do you think your performance at school, do you think, you know, the kind of student you are means that you deserve to get that ball? And this poor kid, this poor little girl got so upset, she wet herself in front of the class. And she was sent to the principal's office, and I don't have any recollection to what happened to her for the rest of the school year, but I know she didn't show up in third grade, at least to my recollection, right? And I didn't have the knowledge at the time to see that as a racially violent, racially traumatic incident. I just knew it was awful. And it was awful towards another student in class. And so little things like that have happened, I've witnessed throughout the course of my life. Things that kids that I knew said about other kids. You know, and so I think I had, like, a keen sense of fairness. I think my dad also had a role in that. So my first entry into racial equity work was actually into equity, right? And I didn't see it up until, like, 5 to 10 years ago. I didn't see it as racial equity work. I just saw it as, like, I just want to make the world more fair. And it wasn't until, like, I really started to understand. I had colleagues that were able to talk to me about race, white colleagues primarily, I should mention. And I started doing more and more reading, and I started to understand that actually what I was feeling, where my interests were, kind of where my passions were headed, really, they had so much to do about how people of color were treated, not just, like, people. And I started to see the world through, like, a highly racialized lens. And yeah, and that just got, you know, when I went back, you know, when I did my teacher training at Seattle U, they talked a lot about racial equity. And then when I was a high school English teacher, race was a thing. You know, a lot of my colleagues didn't necessarily talk about race so much, but I had some colleagues that did. And then when I wanted to get my doctorate degree, you know, that was all about race. We always had ongoing conversations about race. So by the time stuff, you know, in the Bellevue School District started happening with those community forums, Shomari, like I was already primed to want to talk to somebody about race. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know what the forum was. I felt like I needed to be invited into that space. So when those community forums happened, I kind of felt like, okay, here, I can say something here. Like I can do something here. And so, you know, it's just, I just find it so interesting, the differences between how you and I kind of came to it, you know, how, again, like I, for so long, I was able to see, you know, racial equity just as equity. I didn't have to see it through a racialized lens. And, but that was like, just, you know, non-racialized equity was like my gateway drug to racial equity in lots of ways.
Yeah, I just for a point of clarification for listeners, when you speak about the forums that you attended, those forums were in part sparked by me and my interests to approve or get approved a racial equity policy for our district, our school district, the one I work in presently. And unbeknownst to me and most of the people who I work alongside, it sparked a pretty robust community conversation. Pretty robust, and that's being soft. It was certainly conflict ridden. There was a point in time where we managed to get up to over 600 participants in this community forum. There was a bit of contention between those who were interested in us instituting something around race and those who were fearful of us instituting something around race, and a little bit of a clash that occurred in those spaces on 5 different occasions that we chose to have community forums. And I'm thankful that Paul showed up to represent the white voice of equity, because it makes a difference in those spaces. You know, we sometimes hear from individuals who are either white themselves or who are assuming whiteness by way of cultural normality, who completely contest the idea of instituting anything that would remove power, perceivably so, remove power from the things that they feel as though they have worked really hard to earn. And so due to that fact, we did have a little bit of opportunity to engage in some discourse. And at the end of this 3 years worth of discourse, 3 years, yes, I did say that, we passed a racial equity policy. We did not name it racial equity. We named it the equity and accountability policy. It was the compromise, but in it is a whole lot of meat that allows us to perform in a way that serves our students, our families, and our staff.
You know, Shomari, I remember that first forum I went to, and I was sitting in a classroom at Sammamish High School.
Oh, that was session number, I want to say 3 or 4. It may have been 4 by that time.
Right. 4 sounds right, because there was one at Bellevue High School after that.
That was 5. That was the last one. 4 was pretty robust too. It had about 500 people there.
Yeah. I mean, they were, by the time I joined the effort, which, by the way, the how I got involved was that my wife, you know, who teaches in the district, you know, said to me at one point, like, "Paul, there's some stuff going down around this. You should just show up and see what it's like." Because I had been talking all about like race and stuff like that at home, you know, where it's safe to do so, but I had never really taken the step to going out in the public and actually voicing my opinions necessarily, for any number of reasons, right? But I remember sitting in a classroom in Sammamish High School, and the 2 folks were moderating, you know, BSD employees were moderating in the front of the room, and there were a bunch of parents. And you walked in, I don't know who you were yet. You walked in, and I looked over, and you were wearing a baseball cap, and you had your long hair, and you know, sports coat, all that. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know who that guy is, but if he shows up in a space like this, looking like that, this dude is important. Like, like he's got, people know him, and he, like, what he says matters, right? And then, like, you know, I participated in the forums and all that. And what I thought was so important, what I thought was so interesting about that night were two things. The first was a couple of white parents who stayed after to talk to me because of what I said, and they were trying to talk me out of
recruit you.
Yeah, right. Like they were, you know, they were trying to rebut the things I was saying about all the ways in which I don't have to think about my whiteness when I walk into public spaces. And, you know, they talked about, well, you know, it's not fair that kids of color get spaces at universities that white kids don't get, and everything should be equal, and we shouldn't be talking about equity and yada yada, all that kind of discourse. And I was shocked and kind of surprised by that, because I was so naive at the time. I didn't understand the depth by which implicit and explicit racism actually existed in the community. Right. So that kind of threw me for a loop. And then afterward, I remember another white man who was a member of PABS, Ron, came up to me. He's like, I want to introduce you to some folks. And he walks me over to, I think, Monica. Said, this is Monica Webster or whatever, you know, and I'm like, oh, it's great to meet you. And then there were Black folks around Monica. Like, Monica was talking to other PABS folks. And I remember thinking, this is the largest concentration of Black folks I've ever been with in Bellevue ever. And there was only like 4. Right. So it was just, that whole experience was super eye-opening for me on a number of different levels. And it just kind of reinforced that, like, okay, this is that time I've been waiting for, to just have a voice, to follow somebody else's lead who's been in this space for longer, and just to try to contribute as much as possible.
Yeah. For folks listening, the community that Paul and I live in, Bellevue, Washington, I should say the city, not the community, is extremely multiculturally diverse, extremely, but higher concentrations of some races than others. And so if I were to give an example, I would likely use the one of the demographic breakdown of the school district, because it's relatively reflective of the demographic breakdown of the city in which we live. Whereas people who look like me, Black people, in the school district, we represent presently 3.2%, 3.2. It goes up and down. It fluctuates on an annual basis. I've seen it as low as 2.1%, but we hover around there. And I know our city is in between 2 and 3 quite normally. In our school district, the largest racial subgroup is Asian, presently topping out at about 43% of our district. The second largest is white, which represents about 37%. And the numbers drop off pretty substantially after that, of course, because we only have 100%. And so we have our Hispanic Latino families next at around, I think this year it's around 12%. It usually hovers around 13%. And then we have our indigenous, which is less than 1%, and our mixed race students, who represent 7% this year. And so roughly. So with that though, there's a greater opportunity for the small concentrations of historically minoritized BIPOC families to really get this strong sense of feeling like they don't fit in this community, because this community does not serve Black and brown people very well. The city does not serve Black and brown people very well. When Paul speaks to PABS, PABS stands for the Parent Alliance for Black Scholars. It's a group that I started 4 or so, maybe 5 years ago now, which enlisted our Black parents from the school district where I work to assemble on a consistent basis to put forth efforts collectively to eradicate the challenges that some of our Black babies are experiencing. So very strong group, and it really bleeds into the next question that's on the table, which is around how our lives intersected. And they may actually have intersected at different times for our different experiences. And so, like, I didn't know Paul was in that room at Sammamish because I didn't know Paul, and there was a lot of white people in that room. They tended to dominate that space, and so Paul was one of the white people in the room. And I walked into every room, and I saw hundreds of people that night, and so I would not have singled him out. But the first real time I recollect even engaging with you was at a PABS meeting. And it may not have been a PABS meeting. It was a meeting prior to a PABS meeting, maybe, but the PABS meeting is the one I remember the most. It was a meeting where I was being asked some questions, which I'm not sure if that led Paul to come to a PABS meeting or not, but I remember PABS, Parent Alliance for Black Scholars, right? Black parents, Black students, this white dude rolling in like, I'm here, like, for me to work. I'm like, who is this dude, man? Who is this joker? What the hell does he want, right? And what's his motive? And totally, I'm insta suspicious. We did have another white gentleman who was a part of the PABS group who had a adopted Black child. And so I introduced myself, and I mean, we bonded fairly instantly. He came through in a manner and with a perspective of, I'm here to be a servant to the work, and so if you find opportunities and roles where I can use my white voice to transform the way that white people think, or transform the way that Black people in this space experience white people, then please put me to work. And that was a valor thing to do, because we were in desperate need of people from that particular race to engage in conversation and dialogue and take information back to spread to other white people is very important for us in that group. And so I'm appreciative of the effort, and we just continue to move and shake from there. And I'm really interested to know, like, how our lives intersected for you.
Yeah, two things have always kind of stuck out to me. The first, Shomari, was seeing you at the forums and knowing you were somebody of significance in the district. I've been in the Bellevue School District for a number of years, and you can just tell when somebody walks in the room, there's a weight to different people, and you had, like, there was a gravity to you when you walked in the room that was pretty clear, at least to me. And then I remember Monica Webster, who I think was part of the PABS leadership at the time, contacted me as like, hey, let's get together at a restaurant, and me and some folks just want to talk to you. And it was at a Mexican restaurant.
Yes. Oh,
and you
yes,
rolled in, and I thought, okay, like, here we go. Like, this is the interview. Like, this is, it made total sense, right? I mean, it made total sense why, you and Monica and other folks who were part of that organization would need to talk to me first before you let me come to
I totally forgot that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and it was great. Like, I remember talking to my wife, like, today's a day. Like, I get, today's the day I get interviewed to maybe join this group. Like, this seems like it could be a really good thing. But yeah. And that, you just asked me, some kind of general questions, I think, from what I remember about, like, myself and why I was interested in doing the work. And, and I think it just kind of, and I started attending meetings, and it just kind of took off from there. Yeah. The one thing, I don't know if this has anything to do with it, Shomari, it might, and this might be a topic for a conversation later, but I think a lot about why white folks maybe choose not to get involved in conversations about race and racial equity. And I think there might be this idea out there that by getting involved, it either sets you up to fail, or it'll force you to confront things that you don't want to confront. And I'm kind of curious, based on your experience as a Black man working in this space, how many white folks have you like run into, or you communicate with, or you work with, who you think kind of understand what's involved in racial equity? Or like when you talk to folks, is there a difference between folks who seem to really want to do the work and those who don't? Like, is there a consciousness thing? Is there just a thing you can tell?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can sniff it from a block away. You know, there's a certain disposition that someone shows up in that is easy. It's very easy for me. It's not easy for all, but it's very easy for me to pluck out the woo boys. You know, what I mean by woo boy is the drunk white dude at the party who's yelling woo. You know, who want to be in your presence and in your space because you're a Black man, and they you know, they gain from you the power that they feel that they need in order to have these conversations. However, not necessarily firmly believing in a self-transformation that will advance the movement. What I will say is that thinking back to the interview at the Mexican restaurant, you know, and I often have to let people know, because I'm very particular about Black space, incredibly particular about Black spaces and spaces that Black people get to connect with one another on levels that has to be devoid of white voice and white presence. I don't let white people co-opt spaces that is not for them. You're gonna have to leave if that is your intent, you know, to feel affirmed by way of being involved in something that will bring you cred, but you're not bringing anything to the table for those others. Not about that life, you know. And I'm very protective of things that people share, because it is not in jest. Like, this is experiences that people have had that sometimes are sparking trauma and re-traumatizing them in ways that will have a long-term impact on their lives. I'm right now thinking about the story that you told earlier about the young lady and, you know, her bouncy ball and what happened with her in that classroom space. And fast forward, she's the age that you are now. And I'm very curious to know, like, how much did that have an impact on her life? Some impacts drive people to defy the stigma that has been assigned to them. Some impacts truly disrupt a person's progress towards whatever their goal would have been otherwise if they weren't given, you know, this assignment of being lesser than. And so, yes, I can sniff it out all the way down the road. I am not afraid to tell white people to, you know, kick rocks, keep it pushing. And we don't need that narrative in our spaces. But I found you to be pretty genuine. And with regard to the PABS group, it was a Black space that was intended for Black people to find an opportunity to connect amongst one another, but also for Black people to come together to seek the transformation necessary to ensure that the experiences that their children were going to have are ones that were different than the ones that they themselves had when they were coming through school. Knowing that many of our folks who are in this age demographic that I am, and I'm in my mid-40s, whether they were in schools like the one that I grew up in the Midwest, or schools that were other places across the country or outside of the country, many folks of my hue have experienced some challenges in those spaces, especially when those spaces are outside of very homogenous spaces. And so I'm conscious, and I just really want to absolutely reaffirm that if not for the way you showed up that day, I would not have even entertained your presence in that room or in that space. But knowing very well that you were a necessary evil to our transition towards ensuring the eradication of all of these challenges that our Black people need. White people need to talk to white people for sure. In putting in place tremendous amounts of BIPOC folks, even if you give them a little bit of a title and a badge, that says, I work for this place. There is still this lack of opportunity for some of us to thrive and succeed in real transformation. And so we must enlist the voice of white conscious leaders in ways that they can take the fight when we get tired. I get tired, and sometimes I need someone to pick it up. And I don't want to put that on another Black person, because it's not your responsibility, other Black person, to step into the circumstances and the employment that I chose to step into for the purpose of eradicating this for, our future children. I won't assign that to, Black people. It's like crabs in a barrel trying to climb out, who's, at the top of the barrel, close enough to get out. Oftentimes they get out, they don't run back to, save more crabs. I'm here to save the crabs.
Yeah. Yeah. And I could picture folks maybe listening to this thinking, well, how do you, like, what are the steps from growing up in a largely white community, like when you're a kid, to then like working with someone like you in a professional and a personal capacity towards like racial equity? And I've been thinking about this for the past day or so, or like this morning. And I think, there's a lot of discourse out there about like white guilt and white shame. And I think there's a lot of fear about feeling those things. Right. So when I think of my own family, my mom grew up, let's just take my mom, for example. My mom grew up in Wisconsin. Her great grandparents were farmers. And because I've done a little bit of reading on history, I know that her great grandparents got the land they got because the land was violently dispossessed from Native peoples, from indigenous peoples. Right. And so they were able to have a farm. They made money off the farm. Eventually, a generation or two later, descendants were able to move into a white neighborhood in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where the house appreciated, where folks were able to attend colleges like Marquette. They were able to attend universities. They were able to go out and get like jobs as accountants in corporations. They were able to accumulate wealth from those jobs and from housing appreciation and all of that. And then there are lots of like downstream impacts from that, right? Then when my mom then goes off and has a family on her own, she's able to maybe get some help from her family to buy a house in a largely white neighborhood, which then appreciates wonderfully over the course of time. And because she and my dad, who's also white, and all my siblings are white, then like, because we were able to live in that neighborhood, the house gained equity over time, right? And so when it came time for us to have stuff, even if it was a little bit outside the reach of a teacher's salary, they were able to have those things, right? My grandmother, I remember helping out my parents and paying for our tuition to go to private schools, right? And my grandmother having that money because her husband was an accountant because he could go to college, right? So there is this residue of whiteness that I think has followed me, right? Like I work very hard. There were some parts of what I have that were earned, if we want to call it that. But I would also be really, really misguided if I thought that some of that didn't have to do with my whiteness and the compounded privileges and advantages that my family, going back generations, were able to have because of different policies that were in place that were white supremacist policies, right? And so I think and all of that work I had to do on my own, right? Like some folks helped me here and there. I came into contact with folks. I had my very first Black friend was in college, and I remember him telling me, I said something about colorblind, and he made some comment in a bar where he said, let's be real with each other. I'm Black. You don't see me as color neutral. I'm Black. I know you're white. Let's stop talking like we don't know there's race. That's part of this. So I had some folks who like mentored me throughout the process. But I think by the time I showed up in those community forums, I had tried to do so much work understanding myself and my history that I just acknowledged that like my parents are probably racist. How could they not? How can my mother not be? She grew up in a highly segregated community of Green Bay, Wisconsin. How could she not, like, how could she not have heard stuff that her parents said? Even though my dad was a very well-intended guy, he would ask me questions like about white guys in basketball, right? And I adore both of them. I adore my grandparents, but I could also acknowledge that like they were likely racist to some degree, because also they were just swimming in the water that is American society. And so I think by the time I actually got to those community forums, I had so many conversations with folks. I'd read so much that it wasn't talking about race wasn't a guilt thing. It was just like, it was like talking about what I wanted for lunch that day to an extent, right? Like there weren't all these emotions attached to it. I already assumed that I had privileges that were unearned. I already assumed that I'm never going to be able to root out all the racist parts of my upbringing, right? That I'm going to screw up, that at some point I'm going to have a conversation with you, Shomari, and I'm going to say something really dumb and you're going to call me out on it. I'm probably going to feel bad, but that's okay. You know,
Don't worry, I'm about to do that in a minute. Keep going.
Yeah, right. So, like there's all these different things that I think like that just gave me advantages that when I finally ran into someone like you, I was able to have conversations that maybe I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah, it's sort of an important story to tell, lesson or story to tell. For white folks to grow in this effort and in its work, you have to continuously and perpetually put yourself in spaces where you may get schooled, that you may get told something very different than how you walked into the room thinking or believing. And you're seeking the opportunity to be corrected, or at least to seek or receive a multiple perspective to validate the belief that you might potentially have. I think it's really important. I'll go back to a couple highlights in your story. All white people are racist by default. I don't care how much you work at it. Mm-hmm. There's something in you that society has given you. It's gifted you with a thing that has inadvertently put you in a position of superiority over others, as depicted by every single thing that you interface with in the world. When you leave this country, white people are still in positions of dominance, across the globe. When you show up to the place that is homogeneously different than by the color of the skin of the people who live there than the place which you come from, 99.9% of the times you are welcomed with open arms. Like, oh my God, white man is going to grace our presence with wealth, and with something that we don't have. Right. I watched this play out in a very sinister way. My first trip to Thailand, I went on a group trip with 13 other people from the YMCA. And this particular year, I was a participant. The next year, I was a co-leader. But this year, I was the only Black person. There was ton of white people, one Latino person, one Laotian person. And I remember we did some fun stuff first, and then we drove to a small village where we did a week-long service project. We're going to build a school. It was phenomenal. And when we parked the bus in this is a tiny village. I mean, like there's nothing for tens of miles. And when we showed up, there were two rows, kind of like when you saw in remember that TV show Fantasy Island?
Yeah.
The plane, they put the lay. And so there were two rows of mostly kids waiting for us to get off the bus. I'd say 50 kids in each line, all had lays ready to sort of put over the people who were getting off the bus. We had one relatively attractive white girl with us, blonde hair, blue eyes. She got off the bus, like the whole put the lay on you operation stopped, bro, the whole thing. And they like ran to touch her, like couldn't believe that she was here, or asking for autographs. This is a random 22-year-old YMCA employee, is not known by anyone in this country. And the reception that she received was as if she were a female version of Jesus. It was quite striking. I've never experienced that before. It's kind of like you got your bags and you're ready for someone to take them. And, they walk right past you to this other person who they prefer. And these are people of color who are darker than I. I just found that fascinating. And then as I continued to journey through that 3-week experience, I remember going into the drugstore and just seeing rows, multiple, of whitening cream as folks in this community wanted to lighten their skin, because lighter skin, the closer you are to white, the likely you are to be rendered as in power or of opportunity in many countries where colorism is a thing. And so I offer that to say that as a white male, you won't walk through the world without privilege, no matter how much confidence or consciousness or development or opportunity you have to have discourse with me. You're just gifted with positionality from jump. Your parents were definitely racist, because if I today had gone to your parents then and said, based on how this land was ascertained, we're going to take out some of this equity and give it to the natives from which this land was derived, that would not have flown. That would not have been a good deal. I promise you, especially in the 50s, the 60s, ain't no way, and Black people during that era were no one. They were nobody, they were depicted on TV and in films as mammies and servants. And so there's no way literally possible for the upbringing that your family had and the upbringing that they gave you. There's no way possible that it was not rooted in racist ways. And racism, if we look at the definition of it, purely is the sole belief that you are better than this other group, to the point where you treat this group as inferior. Folks who are sitting in a position of less privilege do not have the potential to be called a racist. It's not how the racism is defined. I could never be a racist, even if I hated all the white people on the planet. I'm prejudiced, but I'm not in a position of power enough to be defined as a racist. Racism is held for one group in our country, and that is our white people, and white people need to understand that there's no way for you to live without it. But there is ways, and there are ways for you to monitor it and continually improve upon it for you and for the rest of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's always kind of a journey for me, I think, to not be beholden by whatever guilt and shame I feel, because that's not productive for helping, take a turn at the oars, so to speak. Right? Like the more I wallow in whatever feelings I have about, my inability to not have privilege or what have you, or, all those things you listed about, there's no way that, that my parents weren't racist and all that. Like, in many cases, those feelings don't matter. Right? Like, really what matters is that I acknowledge that they're there, that I acknowledge my history, but that I use that to be productive, right? Like, and when I think about how our lives have intersected, one of the reasons why I so value like our personal professional relationship that we have is that I get a chance to be productive, at least in a very small sphere of influence, to try to make sure that like kids don't experience that same level of racism, of oppression, of feeling harmed, of not feeling safe, just in one small part of their life, which is school, right? And so like I find myself always having to balance this, like this acknowledgement that I am all of these things, right? Like I'm never going to be able to weed out the racist parts of myself, but I can't let those things hold me back, right? Like I've got to try to move forward in some ways that helps dismantle the system. And I've got to like not do it on my own. I've got to work in collaboration with folks who are most harmed, right? Because it's not about me, it's about what you want, and it's about what you think, will serve you best. And I've got to be okay, like, working with you on those things. Right. And I don't really know how to describe it, like, right now sitting here, better than that. But I everything you said was spot on. And I think for white people to be able to move forward in these spaces, we've just got to get comfortable with that, with those truths. Like, we've got to get comfortable with the fact that, like, we have all of these things inside of ourselves. Like, we have been inundated by messages that we are better as white people than people of color. And that's had an impact on how we see people of color and how we treat people of color. Like, we've just got to get comfortable with that uncomfortability. And we've just got to acknowledge and accept that this is real and it's in us. But we can't let that stop us from doing things to make the world more just. Like, we just can't let it just sit there.
That's right.
And I don't so when I communicate with folks on in the community forum where I first kind of ran into you, it's always, I'm perplexed a little bit. I don't know. I struggle to know sometimes how to talk to white people about race. Like, I struggle with that. It's still a big source of learning for me. Mostly because I just don't talk to a bunch of folks outside my job and all that, but like, it's a learning point for me. And it's something that I know that I need to do, because that's what I'm called to do. That's my responsibility, is to talk to white folks about race to the best of my ability and to work with them so that we can all move forward together. So there's more of us who can work with folks like you.
Yeah. And I would argue that one of the things that is most paramount in my experience in working with you, alongside you, is that in your profession and your day gig, you're most definitely talking about race with white people, right? And that is, enormous, because, the white people that you are talking to about race are ones that are going to be our future teachers, who talk to our kids of varying races, from white to BIPOC, and teach them the ways of the world. And so I'm afraid of our future if there aren't folks like you out there who, every single day that you show up on Zoom, or at some point in time in a classroom live with students, one of your objectives is to expose them to the things that they will be responsible for when they come see me.
Yeah.
In the school district. Yeah.
I mean, and I actually, I didn't think of it that way at all, Shomari, but that's absolutely right. I mean, I'm lucky and I'm privileged that I have that position, right? And that I have those opportunities to have those conversations with my white students. But I think I'm still messing it up, right? Like, I don't think, there is a role for white folks to talk to other white folks about race. But I also know there's in some cases, I feel like I'm just preparing them to have the conversation with people of color, right? Like, the conversation I'm having with my white students isn't the only conversation they should be having. I'm just trying to get them as prepared as possible for graduate school talk about race, which is with people of color who are unafraid to talk about race.
That's right. And then I would say, another point of opportunity to engage with when talking to your students, not everyone should feel compelled, who looks like me, should feel compelled to have to talk to you about race. Yes. There are some of us who are uniquely positioned to always be in that conversation. I'm happy to be in that conversation with you. I'm happy to talk to your students, which we've done before through a recorded Zoom call. And I'm happy to put myself out there, but just be reminded that that's not the experience of all people. Not all people have put on this proverbial, I've said this in the article that we created, not all people have put on this proverbial flak jacket, this bulletproof vest. Like, I know I'm gonna take shots and hits, and I know that it's gonna potentially bounce off. It may get stuck, but it's like not gonna penetrate my soul. until it does, right? Because if you take enough of those hits over and over, especially in the same spot, it goes right through that vest, and then it starts to negatively impact you. Sometimes you bleed out, hypothetically speaking. And so just in speaking to those white students, remind them that it is their responsibility, not the responsibility of those that they want to run to and seek to have a conversation that is riddled in discourse. It's not their responsibility, those people who are on the receiving end of that, to provide those white folks with this narrative of their lives. Just be mindful that that's privilege. You're a privileged MF if you feel comfortable enough to roll up to any person of color and engage in conversations about race and ask deep and deepening questions that hyper expose that person in ways that they may not want to be exposed. That's privilege. You're not, no skin off of your back. You're just a learner, and you're kind of like a I'm not going to use that term today, but you're kind of taking information. I don't want to say stealing, but that's the word that first comes to mind, so I'm going to use it. You're kind of stealing from the people who you are seeking to grow from, never regenerating or giving anything back. That's privilege. And we have to find ways to ensure that people understand that. Don't go out and run to the first person of color that you see. Like, even if you have a Black friend, quote unquote, please ask them first if they're comfortable in engaging in this type of dialogue. If they are willing to share, thank you for gifting me with this opportunity to learn and grow. Like, what can I do for you, in return? Like, be gracious and grateful for that opportunity to be able to have that dialogue from someone who is not responsible for giving it to you.
Yeah. I mean, it's important, I think, for folks to know, you and I didn't just start off like talking like this. Like,
right.
We didn't go 0 to 60 after 5 minutes of meeting each other.
That's right.
It was a slow simmer where, finally we got to the point where we're like, all right, like, let's meet once a week and let's like start talking about stuff.
Yeah. And then COVID hit and I just got salty. So then we had a lot of things to say. Got it. That's what really happened. If we want to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, but like, it takes time. And there's a ton of trust that's involved with it. I can't crawl into your head and into your heart, but I assume that like you had to be sure to protect yourself against
Always.
me, because I'm sure you've run into other nice white folks, and there's probably, and I think you probably mentioned this before, like you run into other white folks, you start to feel safe. And then there's that one thing that's said at a dinner party that just totally throws you back, and the white person is totally oblivious. Right.
Yeah.
So it's, so, I mean, even the fact that we were able to have these conversations, I think, is testament to what you were just saying, right? That it's slow. It has to happen over time. And I think you had to be convinced that I like that I'm in the work to be in the work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, I also have gotten to the stage of my life where my patience is very, very slim, very slim. And so if you are a white person who was not open and willing to the idea of self-transformation, I'm out, bro. I ain't got time for you, to be real. Like, I'm on a mission to galvanize as many soldiers as possible, white and non-white, to charge forward towards equity and justice. If you are going to take a tremendous amount of work, and this isn't my job, I don't get paid to hold your hand through this process, right? And so I'm out. Like, I got to do my job in the way that my job needs to be done in order for me to, make inroads towards the goals that I have, to transform and transition our system, which is incredibly slow. And I lose partnership with other people in my life who identify as Black or, BIPOC or other of color groups, racial groups. And a lot of it is because they don't understand why I have this position, but I can't make the immediate change that is necessary to transform the experience for their children or they themselves. but just know that the job is hard. It's rough. It's a grind. It is manipulative, in the way that I have to show up sometimes. It is building relationships with people that I don't necessarily want to build relationships with. It is building and depending on critical partners who don't always have your back in the process, but I'm choosing to be selfless. Like, I want to give you the thing that is necessary for the change. I don't need the credit. I need the change. I don't care who's making the change happen. Just make the change happen, right? And hopefully that is the way that I get to live my life throughout. And so as we wrap up here, Paul, man, I'd like to say a couple final words, but I'm going to give you the floor first.
I just want to hear your final words.
Yeah. I genuinely appreciate you and the space that we're in, the ability and the privilege that we have right now to be able to input our voices into a space where others will listen. This level of discourse here between a white man who grew up in this particular community in this way and a Black man who grew up in this community this way, coming together to have intentional dialogue around things that we haven't been able to resolve in the entire history of our country. I think this is really phenomenal. I think it's revolutionary. I think it's going to, at minimum, incite change amongst ourselves and build incredible bonds to ensure that we are collectivists in our approach to disrupt the things that are not empowering people who look like me. And so for that, I feel blessed and I am appreciative, and I look forward to many more opportunities to engage in this dialogue.
Yeah. Me too, Shomari. I mean, we've spoken about this a lot before, but it's just counting you as a friend of mine. And I'm so privileged and so lucky that I get to have these conversations with you, and that you want to have these conversations with me. I think that's just, I get the feeling that's really rare. And I'm just pleased that, to the extent that they are helpful, people get to hear what these conversations are like from folks like us.
Yeah. So to my comrades in the field who are doing this work, I value you, and I really appreciate the energy, the effort, the time, the stress, the trauma that you experience. One thing that is supporting me, I would say one thing that is saving me right now, that is preventing me from jumping off that proverbial cliff, is the fact that I get to have these types of conversations, with someone who is open enough to receive all the punches in the face. The cool thing about working with Paul is I punch Paul in the face a lot. His nose is a little crooked, if you can see it, right? Because I've broken it several times. And he keeps coming back. And I think that's awesome. I get to be authentically salty and angry and engaged in ways that he will be a listener, and he gets to find pathways to support people like us, and also grow in his consciousness and leadership for the work. And do know that my responsibility in this particular relationship is to continue to drive you forward. It's my goal. Before you know it, you're going to be on some incredible Robin DiAngelo platform, speaking truth to power, writing books, changing lives. And so I'm excited about it.
Well, I mean, if that's in our future, I'm not going there without you.
No, you can't.
Exactly.
I'm coming. You may not want me, but I'm coming.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of hesitancy out there from white folks to actually have these conversations with folks of color, in particular their Black friends or their Black acquaintances. And I just hope that folks, if anything, I just hope they figure out that, like, those conversations are necessary, but that they bear some responsibility to, like, really reflect on who they are and where they came from and their upbringing, and like that they need to do work first, but that shouldn't stop them, right? Like we're at the point now where we all need to be doing this work. At least white folks all need to be doing this work. And so to the extent that these conversations might be useful, that I'm proud to be a part of them.
Right on.
Yeah.
To our friends and listeners, thank you for sticking with us through this opportunity. And this is Shomari Jones.
And this is Paul Sutton.
And we're signing out for the day. Take it easy. Have a good rest of your week.